the human appropriation of nature. That is to say, transformation of nature into an environment for the development of the human being as, these are his words, species being, and the strange term means nothing more and nothing less than as a being which indeed for the first time can freely develop and satisfy its specifically human faculties. Specifically human faculties, and these are the creative faculties of man and his aesthetic needs and faculties. So you have here the first conception of a revolutionary aesthetics as contrasted with the capitalist aesthetics, and aesthetics not as pertaining to art, but as productive force, reconstruction of society in the radical redirection of the process of production. A redirection which would take care, which would take into account in the mode of production itself the aesthetic and creative needs and faculties of man. Again, creative, here contrasted with capitalist productivity, work, here contrasted with alienated labor, meaning work with things and other human beings, and not against things and other human beings. The result would be the formation of the object of matter, and again I quote, also for the sake of the thing, and not only for my own sake. This is perhaps the most speculative, but also one of the most interesting conceptions of Marx, which goes way back into the history of Western thought, namely the assumption that there is such a thing as an objective freedom in nature, as counterpart and element of human freedom, namely a drive, a striving in matter, perhaps also in inorganic matter, to show, to display its inherent qualities, its own potentialities, to be, to become what it can become, without violence, without distortion, without being oppressed, without being smashed. These are indeed aesthetic qualities, and Marx makes them explicit. Explicit in one of the most advanced formulations, and in a formulation which seems to fit very little the traditional image of Marx we have, namely, he says that man is a being who is able to form his world in accordance with the laws of beauty. In accordance with the laws of beauty. I think you will admit it is indeed a strange formulation if you look at it in the light of the usual picture of Marx, and still I think it is one of his most advanced formulations. What is at stake here is not nearly the materialistic translation of the aesthetic into a socialist reality, but rather the failure to carry out this concept into the critique of political economy. Marx himself, if he would have been afraid of the radical consequences of this conception, has not built it into the later economic and political theory. Now, I could still give you a brief glance at this concept in the light of the history of Western thought, but I'm afraid it would take too long, and I will only enumerate some of the main points. The concept of a revolutionary aesthetics, of the radical emancipation of the senses in the reconstruction of society, is one that has already been alive in the long tradition of the heretic materialistic schools of thought, in the hedonistic and sensualistic philosophies from antiquity to the Enlightenment. It is even compatible with Kant's aesthetic in the third critique, and it is perhaps most interesting, the materialistic reformulation of Hegel's concept of nature as objective spirit, as manifestation of the spirit. Moreover, this idea, the idea that there is in nature itself, in the things themselves, something that would make for human freedom and for freedom of nature itself, the idea of inherent aesthetic qualities in things may well recapture the most ancient theory of recollection, knowledge as recollection, namely the discovery of the true forms of things, the discovery of the true forms of things, which are distorted and denied in the established reality. This conception, which places sensibility in the center of radical social change, desublimates the idea of freedom without abandoning the transcendent content of freedom, namely that it is not yet a reality, that it is still a historical and political goal. It desublimates the idea of freedom because freedom now appears as rooted in the sensibility of man. The senses do not only receive what is given, they are not only, as Kant believed, the basis for the epistemological construction of reality, but the senses may also serve as basis for the transformation, subversion of the established sensibility and for a rational organization of society. Or the senses do not delegate this necessary transformation of the given data to another faculty, the mind, the understanding, reason. Rather, the senses discover, or at least can discover by themselves in their practice, now new and more gratifying possibilities and capabilities, new forms and new qualities of things. In this sense, the senses have their own rationality, striving to become reason. And emancipation of the senses, far from collapsing into mere sensuousness, would mean developing the new sensibility to serve as the rational basis for the construction of a new society. This emancipation of the senses, and that is why I spoke of a desublimation of freedom, would make human freedom what it is not yet, namely a sensuous need, not only a value, not only an economic need, not only a political goal, but a sensuous need. Without it, without the satisfaction of it, you cannot live. It would make freedom a sensuous need, an objective of the life instincts themselves, an objective of eros. However, not the repressed sensibility in a repressive society, but only the emancipated senses working on the construction of a free society can possibly fulfill this radical function of sensibility. In a society which is based on alienated labor, human sensibility is blunted too. Men perceive things and other human beings only in the forms and functions in which they are given, in which they are made, in which they are used by the existing society, and they perceive only those possibilities of transformation as defined by and confined to the existing society. And thus, and I think this is the most radical insight of the conception of the emancipated senses, thus the existing society is reproduced not only in the mind of men, not only in the consciousness of men, not only in their behavior, but also in their senses. And no persuasion, no theory, no reasoning can break this prison unless the fixed, the petrified sensibility of the individuals is dissolved, that is to say, is opened to a new dimension of history, a new dimension of practice. Or, in other words, until the oppressive and submissive familiarity with the given object world is broken in what I like to call a second alienation, namely the methodical alienation from the alienated society. I should like to quote here the famous statement by Rimbaud, which is only too easily misunderstood today. He speaks of a dérèglement de tous les sens. Dérèglement de tous les sens as aesthetic and political principle, as radical aesthetic and political force. It is the same insight that only if a radical change in the sensibility of man takes place, is there a chance that a qualitatively different society can be created. Now, I have at several occasions referred to the tradition of Western thought in order to show you to what extent a great, mostly underground and repressed radical tradition is revived in today's rebellion of the militant youth. What appears easily as a revolt of a spoiled elite, as playful or violent disorder, as mere negation, without solid foundation and without goal, what easily appears as irrational protest is in fact, or let me say more carefully, can be, ought to be, and should be rooted in one of the strongest foundations of radical change, namely the experience that repression and destruction are not only in the social institutions and in the social hierarchy, but also in the very instincts and senses of man, and that therefore the individuals themselves produce and reproduce constantly their own enslavement, their own aggression, their own ignorance, and that their life instincts have been consistently thwarted, weakened by the systematic mobilization of aggression in the defense of the established society. Consequently, no revolution is a revolution unless and until it brings about radical change not only in the social institutions, not only in the consciousness and mind of man, but also in his senses, in the instincts, in the bodies of man. In conclusion, I would like to stress what I tried to stress on Tuesday, that this new unprecedented scope of the rebellion and of the historical goals of the rebellion have become possible thanks to scientific and technological progress. Thanks to scientific and technical progress, and also thanks to the terrible sacrifices brought by those who have fought suppression and injustice throughout the century. These unprecedented goals, unprecedented because for the first time in history we have the resources to attain them, are not attainable through better ways of adjustment. They are not attainable through private release and letting go. They are not obtainable through dropping out of politics. They are attainable only in a long and painful process of political education, in theory and in practice, in and outside the classroom, on the streets, on the media. I want to answer, anticipating it, one question very briefly. Is perhaps the present sweep of ecology an indication that this new sensibility is indeed on the march, and that it is indeed already in the process of radically changing the world? Certainly, this sweep of ecology is indeed evidence for what I'm trying to say, or did try to say, namely to the extent to which nature, not only human nature but external nature, is rediscovered as a life environment of human freedom. But ecology today shares with all forms of oppositional activity the ambivalence of the whole, in which good and bad, strengthening and weakening of the establishment are inseparably united. The idea of the emancipation of the senses, of a new sensibility, and of the transformation of nature in accord with a new sensibility is more and other than ecology. Certainly, the fight against pollution, noise, ugliness is good and even productive. However, at stake is not the beautification of the existing environment, but its total reconstruction. And this implies elimination of the sources of the far larger pollution, the mental and physical, the political pollution in the system itself. A clean and beautified general dynamics plant is still a general dynamic plant, producing the same stuff. And a clean hydrogen bomb is still a hydrogen bomb. And although it is good and vital to breathe cleaner air, it would still be the air of violence and exploitation on a global scale, unless and until the ecological praxis issues in political practice. And with this shift in the historical level of the protest, with this radicalization of the goals, the space, the dimension of the political practice is changing too. The struggle is not anymore fought in terms of parliamentary business, parties, votes, lobbies, whatever it may be, but it is waged from outside while within the establishment and in terms alien to the establishment. And here lies one of the dangers of this opposition. A danger which I just indicated is rooted in the deep ambivalence which all actions have in our existing society. Let me quote one of the young German radicals who said recently, "Each of us radicals is somehow infested, moronized, saturated, distorted by the goods and evils of the existing society." End quote. These infecting agents cannot simply be pushed aside. The opposition must recognize them and must be able to deal with them on its own terms. In one way or the other, however, the new values of a free, decent, and fair society with non-alienated relationships between individuals, these new goals must somehow show forth in the behavior of the nonconformists today, which from the beginning excludes any premature identification between personal and private release and social liberation. For example, the famous sexual revolution is none if it does not transcend and transform itself into a revolution of the whole human being, with new social and political goals. The distinction which is absolutely indispensable for the movement, the distinction between self-indulgence and liberation, between phony and authentic nonconformism, between crime and political action, this vital distinction must be made by the militants themselves. It cannot be imposed upon them by any authority whatsoever. But if they do not make this distinction by themselves, if they do not find their own discipline, their own organization of spontaneity, and all authentic spontaneity is organized in one way or the other, then they will have dangerously weakened the only force that stands today between us as we are here and an intensified repression, the consequences of which I would not like to foresee. Thank you.